Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending upon which part of the planet you're on. I am Janice Kaminer-Resnick, and I welcome you to our America at a Crossroads program tonight. On behalf of our leadership team, Zev Yaroslavsky, Mel Levine, Rabbi Ken Chazen, and Caroline Kelly, I welcome tonight's guests, Ruth Ben Ghiat and Larry Diamond, two outstanding university professors and scholars. Next week on November 15th, we will welcome the always engaging and interesting best-selling author, David Brooks of the New York Times, who will be in conversation with Madeline Brand. The topic is human connection. Brooks is a student of and a commentator about social and human interaction in public policy, and he's always interesting. And we hope that you'll be with us. The following week is Thanksgiving. We have no program that week, so we're skipping the week of November 22nd. I hope you are all doing well with our new Zoom-based registration system. Those of you who made it onto the program have figured it out. It's really very simple compared to our previous Eventbrite system, but just know that the emails come directly from Zoom, and I don't have a Zoom link. I only have registration links, because after you register, you get emails from Zoom. Always look in your spam if you can't find the email, and then if all else fails, email me, and you know that I'll attend to getting you connected some way or the other. It is now my honor to introduce tonight's guests. Larry Diamond is an American political sociologist and leading contemporary scholar in the field of democracy studies. He is a senior fellow at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University, that's their main center on research for research on international issues. He has written many books about the threats of authoritarianism and about the battle to preserve democracies. Ruth Ben Ghiat is an American historian and cultural critic, and is a professor of history and Italian studies at NYU. She writes, studies, and teaches about fascism, authoritarianism, propaganda, and democracy protection. Both of our guests tonight have dedicated their lives to democratic values. They study, teach, write, and speak. They probably breathe the subject. And we are very grateful to both Larry and Ruth for being with us tonight. I will now hand the program over to Larry Diamond, who will frame the conversation and begin tonight's dialogue. Larry.
Thank you, Janice. Before I begin, if you'll permit me, I want to take a moment to remember and pay tribute to the person whose chair is empty tonight, one of the founders and hosts of this remarkable series, David Lehrer, who passed away suddenly 2 weeks ago. And regular viewers, I think, will know this. David was an esteemed community leader and lawyer in Los Angeles who helped draft the state's hate crime laws. And I really regret that I only got to know him in the context of this program. For those who want to learn more about him, I recommend the Los Angeles Times obituary of him on October 28th. So Ruth, welcome. It's great to be back with you and to have the opportunity to chat with you. We're going to chat tonight about whether autocrats are still gaining ground in the world. Around 2006, the world entered what I called soon after that a global recession of freedom and democracy. I think it took most of the world a while, even quite a while, to see what was happening and to realize the gains that autocrats were making. But after Putin consolidated authoritarian power in Russia, and Hugo Chavez did the same in Venezuela, strong men began to concentrate power and even crush political pluralism and the rule of law in quite a number of other countries, that many of which you've been paying attention to. Hungary and Turkey, we'll talk about them, cease to be democracies. Democratic institutions like the courts, the media, civil society organizations came under very considerable pressure in Poland, in the Philippines, recently in India, in Brazil, in Mexico, and more recently in Israel. So Ruth, before we address the question of whether authoritarian strongmen are proliferating or declining, that is the headline question of our session this evening, you wrote the book on strongman rules. So is there a common playbook here? What enables a demagogue to ride to power and destroy democracy?
Well, thank you, Larry, and thank you, everyone. I'm really happy to be here to talk about such vital, important subjects. there is a playbook, and I wrote my book, Strong Men, because I felt it was time to look back at a century of authoritarianism. I focused mostly on right-wing authoritarianism because I didn't see a book that, talked about fascism, but then it's like, what happens after 1945 to all of this? And then it goes through the right-wing military coups, and then the new authoritarians, I call them, the Bolsonaros, the Orbans, and Trump is in the book. But there are recurring kind of tools of rule, as I call them, that these people use very effectively. Corruption, which isn't just financial corruption. It's how do you get people to buy into your lack of ethics, to agree to do things they never thought they would do. Propaganda, of course, violence, and machismo. Masculinity is very important, and personality cults. Only they can save the nation. They're the heroes, but they're also the victims. So we can come back over this combination of victimhood and heroism and savior is really key to their, it's one of their secrets of why they appeal to people. And it's been this way from Mussolini up to the people today.
Well, I was almost inclined to say great. That is great analytically, but sobering in terms of what we confront. So we've had a lot of movement in different directions. Trump was defeated. Bolsonaro was defeated. There's another election recently I think you might want to reflect on, but we've had a spate of elections in which strongmen, authoritarian strongmen, have had differing outcomes. So how do you assess the question that headlined this session? Are strongmen losing ground, or are they, consolidating and proliferating?
Yeah, it's really, it's a very dramatic moment in this kind of clash between democracy and autocracy. So, Freedom House and other entities that track these things, tell us that over 70% of the world's population is now governed by some form of illiberal rule. So that's very sobering. So that suggests it's spreading. But we're also seeing, and we're just not, we're not hearing about this as much. It's not the front page news, I believe it should be. We're seeing cases of what I call autocratic backfire. Like, think about Putin, where when he entered the war, his state was shown up to be, ravaged by corruption. The mighty Russian military was shown to be, quite incompetent. Hundreds of thousands left to not be cannon fodder. There's been, and then in China, we don't hear about those protests, the lockdown protests, but 79 universities had protests in November 2022. That's very significant. So we're seeing global, around the world, we're seeing large nonviolent mass protests, often against authoritarian regimes. Think of Iran. And they are the biggest that those countries have had for years. So on the one hand, we have, and in fact, the dynamic is that the more people show in large numbers that they want freedom, the more that autocrats double down and become more rapacious, and all they have at the end is repression and lies. So we're at a kind of very dramatic point. I see if we look at this very large picture, global level.
Good. So one of the things that characterizes many of these authoritarian regimes, certainly not the one in China, and not even worth talking about the one in Russia, and obviously not the one in Saudi Arabia or in Iran, but in a number of these authoritarian regimes or quasi-authoritarian regimes, they do still have competitive elections. And it does create a potential opening for an electoral shock or an electoral surprise. There have been a few of these elections this year with diverse outcomes, and there's some big ones coming next year. So how do you reflect on, recent developments in that regard?
Yeah, I've watched very carefully, in Turkey, in Hungary, Poland, Italy, Israel, to see what lessons we can learn also for our own country in what works against autocrats, or how do you have a U-turn if your country is in a democratic decline. We're a very different case because we don't have the multi-party, because one of the cardinal rules is unity is everything. The more unity, the larger the unity coalition that you put up against the autocrat, the more strength you have. But the other thing, and this is a mistake that has been made, when you're in a situation like a Turkey or a Hungary, where those are different situations, but democracy is challenged or almost absent, and even though there are elections, electoral autocracy, as it's called, you have the elections, but you game the system in various ways so that you weight it to produce the outcome that you need. So oppositions are of course, they're on the defensive. And one thing that has started to happen is, instead of standing up for a true progressive alternative against these far right or repressive people, in Turkey and in Hungary, they kind of moved to the center. Like the Turkish opposition ended up espousing a very hard right-wing view on immigration. And they came close to winning, which is amazing considering Erdogan's power, but this was a mistake. And in Hungary, the coalition decided to include Jobbik, the far right party, thinking that it could somehow siphon voters from Orban's party. The opposite happened. Jobbik voters didn't want anything to do with the progressives in the coalition, and they defected. Like, I think 800,000 of them went and voted for Orban. So one of the lessons is, if you have a far right threat or autocratic threat, you've got to stand up for a real progressive alternative and real strongly worded values that are different. Provide a real alternative. That's another lesson.
An inclusive alternative. Don't try and mimic the illiberal populists, because you'll just be a version of it, and people will choose the real thing.
And in Poland, which came out well for democracy, they did just that. And indeed, they channeled, kind of very progressive platforms. They had, in a country dominated by hate ideologies since 2015, they actually had love. They had heart symbols. They talked about unity, solidarity, all these progressive values, and it worked.
I have a hunch we have some college students and young people watching this session. Many people think there's a lesson from the Polish election in that regard as well. Is there anything you want to call out there?
Yeah, and in fact, it was an election where young people were a very important part of the vote, and you had a connection between mass mobilization, mass rallies, and electoral, like high turnout of voting. So you had the highest turnout of voting since 1989. You had the biggest demonstration since 1989. That's quite significant. And young people they voted in far higher numbers than people over 65. And so we see this around the world because of the climate crisis. And, autocrats don't, I say this in my book, Strongmen, autocrats don't just endanger democracy. They are an existential threat to humanity because they plunder the environment, they plunder the workforce. And now with, the persecution of LGBTQ people, this young generation feels extremely personally this threat to themselves, and they are turning out in large numbers, as they did in Poland, if the opposition gives them an opportunity to feel connected.
And they, because they eviscerate checks and balances, human nature then takes over, and they become incredibly corrupt, which is an element of the rapaciousness that you were referring to.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, that's their Achilles heel. So one of the liberal democracies that saw the extraordinary broad-based mobilization against this authoritarian drift, and probably turned out more people in the streets in terms of proportion of the population, maybe than any other liberal democracy in the world, is Israel. And of course, all of our attention now has pivoted to Israel's defense against Hamas and the horrific terrorist attacks on it on October 7th. But can we reflect for a moment in the context of this conversation and of your work about what was happening in Israel under the most recent Netanyahu prime ministership and before, in terms of strongman rule and societal resistance against it?
Yeah, so not a Middle Eastern specialist, but Netanyahu checks all the boxes of the strongman temperament, tactics. So I've written about the protests and his authoritarian aggressions in my newsletter, Lucid. It's a Substack newsletter, and also for Haaretz. And you know, this is the classic playbook of when you are facing charges or indictments in other places. Most politicians, non-strongmen type politicians, if they're being investigated or they have problems, they don't want to run for office because, you know, journalists will probe, opposition research. It's just not a good idea. But strongmen, they are impelled to run for office, compelled, because they've got to get to power and shut down shut down any kind of thing that's going to harm them. And so this type of politician, including Bibi, they are laser focused on their own personal survival, you know, staying out of jail. And they are completely self-referential and not so caring about anything else. And so Bibi, you know, in order to get back into power, he allied with extremists. Ben Gvir, as we know, was convicted of supporting terrorist organization. And this was the pact that he made. So we see, you know, shifting to the right, normalization of extremism. And he's also done things that are classic strongman syndrome. Putin did them, Mussolini, all of them. You don't listen to experts because you think you have all the answers. So he did not listen to his military and security experts, that his laser focus on his judicial reform, which was trying to remove checks and balances so, you know, he wouldn't be prosecuted further, was weakening society and causing the military to be like less combat ready. So, you know, creating a situation of vulnerability. So this is the irony. And this is just the most recent case. The strong man says he will make society stronger and defend the nation. And so many times he makes it weaker and leads it often into ruin because of his personal flaws and temperament, which is a temperament and personal flaws shared by all of this. They're like a tribe, and you can actually predict often what they're going to do if they are faithful to this type of leadership profile.
Yeah, and I might just observe, reinforcing what you said, that their corruption, their incompetence, their obsession with just narrowly entrenching their own rule often leads to calamitous errors. Putin's invasion of Ukraine being a shining example of that. Erdogan has really wrecked the economy in Turkey now. It's why he almost lost. And of course, 1/4 of the population in Venezuela has left the country in the last 8 years. Many of these countries are either have had elections, as we talked about this year, are going to have them next year, and will come to the United States, which is the most important of the ones that will have elections next year. But I do want to note that Venezuela, which we think of as a case that's completely far gone, will have elections next year. And I do recommend to people the New York Times op-ed of about a week ago by a very impressive young Venezuelan civil society activist, Roberto Patino, who made, I think, a very compelling case that Maduro, the successor to Hugo Chavez, actually could be defeated in elections, and we need to do everything we can to help them do so and press for internationally observed elections. Well, before we come to the United States, Ruth, I'd like to pivot a little bit to something that fascinates me, and I think you've thought about a little bit, given your expertise, for example, on Italy and some other Western European countries. Your book is entitled Strong Men, and I underline the second part, Mussolini to the Present. But I know you're well aware of the fact it isn't only men who are capable of concentrating and abusing power. And now we have in Italy and France, two very prominent illiberal populist leaders who are women. And yet, as you've noted, there is a very strong kind of machismo, misogynistic character to strongman rule. So how does this type of autocracy manifest itself or reconcile to having a woman leader?
Yeah, so I didn't include I didn't include women in my book because I really wanted to, it's the first book that elevates hypermasculinity to a tool of rule and shows how it interacts with corruption and with violence, and the personality cult, the man who's above all other men, the infallible man, the untouchable man, all of that. So I felt that was really important to show. But we have now a phenomenon of women who, this new crop of far-right women, to the ones you mentioned, we can add Katalin Novak in Hungary, who was Orban's Minister of Family, and now she's the first female president. And there's a concept that two female political scientists developed called gender washing, where to talk about these people, where they are breaking, the glass ceiling in many ways. And Le Pen is very tenacious, and every time there's an election, she gets closer. So she could indeed prevail at some point. And they purport to be, advancing women's prestige in the world to new levels. But in fact, if you look at their policies, they're hitching themselves to, extreme racism, anti-immigration, demographic policies. It's not just having babies and helping women have babies in Hungary. It's only certain people. They only want certain kind of babies, as Orban famously said. And so, for example, Giorgia Meloni, who masquerades as a conservative and dresses very carefully, like in the manner of Le Pen, in classic, clothes and pastel shades to look non-threatening. She's a hardcore neo-fascist. And she is so extreme on social and social welfare issues. She espouses a version of great replacement theory that's way to the right of Tucker Carlson. She believes it's not just that there's demographic change that's hurting white Christians. She thinks there's a plot by George Soros, the EU, the usual suspects, and she calls this to flood Italy and Europe with non-white immigrants, depress wages, and she calls it ethnic substitution, which is a very scary term. It evokes ethnic cleansing, but it's white annihilation. That's what it evokes, let's say. So there's nothing much progressive about these women, and yet so I say, I wrote a piece in my Substack that they're not going to be stripping off their shirts like Putin does. So they're not, using machismo, but they're just as racist. They're just as big propagandists, and they're just as corrupt as the men.
So before I move on, I think the biggest mistake the European Union has made is not really sanctioning Viktor Orban very
Yeah.
early on when he was moving in this direction. And he was the only autocrat, who was blatantly kind of moving in an authoritarian direction within the EU. And then we had others, and we had Poland, and it gets harder to do. But you have any thoughts on European Union responsibility here, and why no one within the democracies of the European Union has seemed to call out Giorgia Meloni and the kind of government that she's really providing now in Italy?
Well, Meloni's a special case because Meloni is she's a very smart politician. And when she first came after the election, some people thought she would last, and that's not true. She'll last a long time. And she used to be very pro-Putin until just a few years ago. She was wishing him happy birthday publicly. But she's been able, she espouses, she's pro-Ukraine. And this has been very important and very smart of her, because Italy needs the funds of the EU. It needs to have those good relationships for financial and legitimacy reasons. She knows perfectly well that she's a fanatic neo-fascist. And the people, like the president of the Senate of Italy, who's number 2 of her party, he talks about Mussolini in positive ways all the time. He's an unreconstructed fascist. So she needs, it's like her alibi, being supportive of Ukraine. And that way people can leave her alone, or they don't look at what she's doing inside the country, which is extreme homophobia, anti-immigration, anti-Islam, and making reproductive rights more difficult to reproductive care more difficult to obtain, and a lot of checking the boxes of the far right playbook. So that's how she's handled it, and that way, in her case, she seems to be a good partner for the EU, and Americans seem to like her. So she's very able. Viktor Orban's a different case. There have been moves to sanction him or freeze his funds. But in all things, just as when a strongman moves militarily, early action is vital, because for every time an autocrat does something, other autocrats are watching to see how he's treated. And every time there's a failure of punishment, or whatever we want to call it, deterrence, the others conclude that they too can violate rule of law and international norms.
So I want to underscore what you just said, so that when people are thinking, what do I take away from this hour? That's one of the things they take away. All of the experiences that I have read of incipient strongman rule, evolving authoritarianism, suggest that the earlier that society and countervailing institutions like the courts, which is why autocrats and aspiring autocrats move early on against the courts, the earlier the countervailing institutions move to resist this, the more likely they are to succeed. There's no question that has popped up in the chat so far that is more common than some version of, do we have to worry about this all over again in the United States? And if Trump were elected a second time in the United States, would he actually represent maybe even more of a threat of authoritarian rule than he did the first time? So can you reflect on that?
Yeah, the answer is he's one of the most dangerous people in the world, because we already had an attempt to overthrow the government, which it seems like half the population, and I'm not even including the brainwashed half, they can't really deal with the fact that we had a coup attempt and that Trump tried to have his own vice president killed. Like these are things that it doesn't compute for many Americans, and so we're not. He is finally being, prosecuted in different ways, but that's a big problem. My research shows that every time a society has had some danger, Hitler or something come along, they've never been prepared. But that's why I wrote my book, that we have all these case studies. Even when there's a coup, it's very sad. When in the Chile coup, which was my main example of the Cold War, the conservative Christian Democrats, because there's always a conservative elite who enables these guys. The conservative Christian Democrats actually thought that that Pinochet and the junta were going to establish order and then return power to them or to democracy
fairly quickly.
And so even when there's a violent coup with instant torture and stuff, there's still this fantasy that it's somehow going to be okay. And that's also why, in fascist Italy, they were very invested in thinking that Mussolini wasn't Hitler, and Italian Jews in particular. And so they didn't leave. And then when the anti-Semitic laws came, some of them went into exile, but it was a big shock because they thought that Mussolini, even though he was a fascist and allied with Hitler, it wasn't going to affect them. So we have all in the States, we have this more than others because we've been invested in thinking that it can't happen here and that they're not going to come for us. But when strong men come back into power, and like Netanyahu, when they get back, or Orban, they are doubly vengeful, they are doubly aggressive. And it's very clear that Trump wants to finish the job of wrecking democracy and taking America out of any kind of democratic internationalism. So he's always had two things: wrecking democracy internally and aligning the US with the autocrats who he ceaselessly praises.
And it's also my sense that the longer they're in power, whether there's a separation between different terms as there was for Orban and might be for Trump, the longer they're in power, the more they sink their claws into the institutional levers of potential repression.
And they always become more radical, more extremist, more corrupt, never less.
So I think our audience is probably already uncomfortable, but it's not the purpose of this remarkable series to necessarily make people comfortable, although we will end on a more hopeful note. But before then, I do want to ask, because I think it's important that we do this, if you can get a bit more granular. Let's say Trump is elected again, and on January 20th, he takes the oath of office. What do you imagine those 4 years and even the first few months of the second term are going to look like? What kinds of people would he have in his administration, and what are some of the early steps you think he might take?
So if y'all recall, the shock event is what I call them in my book, when Trump came in, and they had a list of 100 executive orders that they were going to implement. Now, they couldn't get to them all, but they implemented the so-called ban on Muslim travel, right? Travel from selected Muslim countries. And they implemented it on purpose in a chaotic manner so that everybody was unprepared. And this was a shock event. It was to make people disoriented. This was Steve Bannon's, you shock the system. We would have this when if they come back, because they've got an army of people, 70 organizations under the umbrella of the Heritage Foundation are working very hard to be ready to have mass purges of the civil service. For example, they're looking for lawyers. The New York Times on November 1st had a very good article, Jonathan Swan and others. They're looking for lawyers. This is right. I thought this is right out of the corruption chapter in my book. They're looking for special kind of lawyers who will not be, how shall we say, encumbered by ethics. Because when you become an autocratic party, for example, with the GOP, you have to renew your political elite. What kinds of people do you need to support autocracy? You need people who are extremists, you need criminals. So a lot of authoritarian regimes, their legislators have criminal records. In 2019, 12 sitting legislators in Modi's India had open like murder charges and major crimes against them. You have people like George Santos, a serial fraudster. And you have Trump himself, who has a record of criminality in many different areas. So you need lawyers who will be unethical to the extent that you need them to be. And so unfortunately, all of this would happen quite fast. And that's why, and this discourse and this kind of blitzkrieg mentality has infected all of the GOP. And that's why Ron DeSantis said famously, we're going to be slitting throats on day one. Now, this was like shocking. He's speaking like Duterte or a gangster, but he meant bureaucratically. And so they have an army of people working with very clear intent to very quickly reshape the government. They're also talking about evoking the Insurrection Act because people like Michael Flynn, who would come back, very dangerous individual, wants martial law. And of course, this is why also Trump was saying perhaps General Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, should be executed. So a lot of very bad things would happen, and I suspect they would happen quickly. The bureaucratic takeovers, purges would happen quickly.
There's a very intimate intertwining of fascism and violence, and the attempt to install Trump illegally in the presidency a second time on January 6th was of course attended by horrific violence and intimidation. How worried are you about interruption of political violence over the course of the next year if Trump loses, if he wins and invites his supporters to crush dissenters? How do you see this playing out?
As you know, there was a lot of, every time we've had an election, there's been fears of widespread, civil unrest or violence, and they have not manifested. The latest time was the midterms, right? But unfortunately, I study fascism, and I have been tracking Trump, and this was the basis of my report for the January 6th committee. Trump is a superb propagandist. He's truly one of the most skilled propagandists of our century. And this will sound ridiculous to some people, but he has been, since 2015, using his rallies and public events as not only radicalization, vehicles. That's why he went to Waco, Texas, where there was the extremists, or he goes to gun stores. But he has been drip, 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 telling Americans that violence is something positive, because every autocrat, and especially the fascists, you have to change the perception of violence from something repugnant, because it's not easy to go after your person on your school board who your kids play together. You have to change violence into something that is patriotic, sometimes necessary, and even morally righteous. And here there's a tie into evangelicals who adopt this kind of armed Christianity, the moral crusade. And Trump has been using I have long list of when he says, the problem is nobody wants to hurt each other anymore, up to, inciting violence as the way to deal with political transitions. And we got January 6th, and also the way to deal with differences. And that's a scary thing as a background thing, because it was used successfully by the fascists as well.
So there are two ways to look at the rising challenge of extremist right-wing violence in support of, let's say, his political project. One way is to be properly and necessarily very, very afraid. Another way is to say, well, in the end, it was horrible to watch. It was a close call, but the institutions held on January 6th. And more than that, many of these people have now, I think dozens of them, been prosecuted, sentenced to jail, and some of these Proud Boys and Oath Keepers and so on for very long prison terms. So I have a two-part question about accountability, but let's start with these trials against all of these people and to what extent you may think it may dampen the enthusiasm for the readiness for political violence in support of Trump and his mission.
It absolutely. In fact, when, for example, when he was arraigned, some of his more, public moments in his legal saga, people expected him to have all kinds of people making trouble, and people think twice before going out and doing things because of this history of prosecution. It's very, very important to prosecute extremists and people like Trump, to show that the rule of law is indeed active, that nobody's above the law, and that there are consequences. It's absolutely key. With leaders, the ideal thing that is not going to happen in our country, but it was used with Berlusconi and it's being used with Bolsonaro, is you ban them for running for office. This is very important because these people have extremely robust personality cults. And this is the most common question people write to me if they see me on TV or something, like, why do people still love Trump after all he's done? And he was extremely smart in how he built his personality cult, and people bonded with him. If you're banned from politics for years, so Bolsonaro's banned until 2030, they become irrelevant because they just simply can't get back to power. And so their personality cult, I use the word deflate. And now we can't do that, but prosecution is just absolutely fundamental for the morale of the population, for the ethics, to show that democratic norms are alive. Because what authoritarians want is to have us become defeatist and feel that we can't defeat them and we shouldn't even try. We should just submit. And or just be in despair and too afraid to speak out and too afraid to show up to vote.
Yeah, if only Hitler had never gotten out of prison. So you're actually answering the other question I had about judicial accountability, which is that directed at Trump now himself. And you seem to be suggesting that the anxieties of those who worry, oh, it's only making him more popular or giving him an excuse for another grievance, that those anxieties are actually misplaced.
Yeah. And people also have the argument that it'll cause violence, but we already had violence. We had January 6th. And he's got this victimhood cult, victimhood culture and victimhood discourse. And that's not going to go away no matter what happens. He uses it all the time. That's not a reason not to prosecute him. Because eventually, some people are starting to peel away from the Trump cult. And it's a slow process, and there's something when people disengage and they start realizing they were duped, or this person isn't who they thought they were. At first, they become very defensive, and they can actually double down because they feel ashamed secretly that they fell for this. So it's a very delicate, it's a process, disengagement, but it is happening. And the more that Trump is held accountable and his family business is shown, because there's all kinds of, we're seeing that the things that he did as a businessman too. And part of his appeal for people is he's supposed to be this successful businessman. So the whole edifice of the Trump persona is now is being exposed. And even if some people don't want to accept that right now, they might accept it later.
I've already started turning to audience questions and merging them with my questions, but now I'm going to continue sharing some of the questions that are coming from our very large and attentive audience. David asks, what are your thoughts about the best way to get and now I'm going to underscore the word, majority of the public? And I think we really want to say a majority of the public whose votes are going to be counted, say, in an electoral college, if there is one, to reject the autocrats. And another way of putting that, which someone also raised, is not why would anyone support this man, Trump? You've answered that. But why is he getting more support in public opinion right now in pre-electoral polls than Joe Biden? Why is he on the verge of winning again?
So we already went over his extraordinary skill at bonding with people, at presenting him, at creating this myth of the man who will make it all better. Fox News has been an extraordinary partner to have this doomsday. There's all these doomsday scenarios, so that democracy itself, and Biden by extension, the end game is to discredit democracy, to associate it with crime and anarchy and white extinction and all the things we've said. And this has a toll. So think about, the economy is not so bad, but the perception is that it's bad, because there's really a kind of, at the level of psychological warfare by assault on our reason, assault on our senses by Fox, just negativity, over and over, repeating these things. And it's had a toll. And so Biden is seen in a certain way and Trump is seen in another way. Think of the age thing and certainly the competence. Trump has been quite incompetent. I had somebody, I get these things every day. Somebody sent me an email and it was polite actually, but he said that he's troubled because I'm not seeing all the things that Trump has done for the country. And he attached a long document of all the accomplishments. And these people really believe that. And they've been helped to believe that by Fox, which is a very, very powerful partner in this problem.
By the way, I should say that I have two young colleagues on the Stanford campus who've just finished a book on authoritarian propaganda. And through very sophisticated statistical analysis, they found that a good kind of baseline indicator of the extent of propaganda is just what Fox News does to selectively broadcast and distort information. So you've talked about Fox News. You've talked by extension about media that amplify his negativity and his talking points. But Doug asks about the role of the media more generally in advancing or retarding an autocrat's aspirations. So I don't know if you want to talk about that across a universe of countries you've looked at, or want to talk about the universe of the media in the United States, but could you kind of expand on the broader universe of media and how media who are not captured by the strongman project either resist or fail to rise to their responsibility?
Yeah, so one of the things that is very frustrating is the way that these figures are glamorized. They capture attention, they know how to do it. And it's not just Fox News, they are treated in ways that is very flattering to them. And this glamorization of this certain type of configuration of male power, it's very hard to shake. So one of the ways, how do you puncture that? Well, investigative journalism, there's a reason that's one of the most dangerous professions in the entire world, is you show that indeed they are corrupt. You show that although they're talking about, representing the people, this faux populism. For example, the the prime minister of Poland, it was of the Law and Justice right-wing party. It was all about the globalists and they're attacking the traditions of the people. The guy's an international banker. He has 3 degrees from 3 foreign countries. Or think about Brexit. So you can expose this hypocrisy. Like Trump is the biggest globalist of all because his whole business model was licensing his name in foreign countries and was propped up by foreign banks, Deutsche Bank, the Chinese. So there are investigative journalists who do this, but it needs to be on the front page, this kind of exposing this hypocrisy. And that's an antidote to glamorizing them and falling for their allure. And the way even the New York Times and sometimes the Washington Post, the way they write their headlines, it leads or it doesn't focus on the violence. It focuses on the control or the appeal that they have. And you have to keep the violence and the corruption center at all times. And there are ways to write headlines and stories so that those are intertwined. But not enough journalists do that.
We have a professor from Israel, Professor Yitzhak, who has an interesting question. What Western leaders are actually confronting fascist and other types of strongmen? This professor says, I only see intellectuals confronting them.
Yeah, I mean, depends what we mean by confronting. There are, there were heads of state who were very strong defending democracy. I mean, honestly, the most vocal pro-democracy head of state, one of them has been Biden. His first press conference in March 2021 was about coming out as a defender of democracy globally, restoring the prestige of America as a democratic power after Trump, tried to ruin it. And then he came around to becoming a very strong defender of democracy at home. And indeed, a lot of the new waves of aggression and Russia's, the idea that Putin felt panicked about his legacy and wanted to go, it's time to go back, another round of imperialist aggression. When Biden and Putin had their summit in the summer of 2021, and I saw them, sitting there where Putin was treated as an equal, and Biden was very commanding, and the American press grilled Putin in a way he's not used to. I didn't sleep that night, and I got a very bad feeling knowing the strong men, because they live in these guys' heads, unfortunately, that Putin might do something. And I wrote in my newsletter that he could become reckless as a way, because Biden being so pro-democratic was an enormous threat. And look at all the stuff that has happened to blunt America. Look at now the disgrace of the GOP. Tommy Tuberville holding up hundreds of military promotions. Rand Paul holding up dozens of important diplomatic appointments. This is sabotage of American power. And it's all a reaction to the extremely strong, even aggressive pro-democratic profile that Biden represented. There are other people, I'm just using him as an example because I know the record the best.
Great. I want to call out two European personalities, one recently elected, the other just elected and about to form a government in Poland. I think Donald Tusk, who was prime minister and then a European Union official and is about to become, I'd say, liberal, centrist, democratic prime minister of Poland, I think he's someone to watch. This is a person of great principle who made no bones about the choice that the Poles were making. And I was recently in Prague for their Forum 2000 annual democracy conference. I've just got to say to you, Ruth, and everybody else, I was absolutely blown away by the remarks made by the Czech president, Peter Pavel, who it's a substantially ceremonial post. The prime ministership runs the government, but the presidency has significant moral authority and international leadership ability. This is a former general in the Czech army, who was very involved in NATO. But I heard him give a defense of liberal values and of basically what we're struggling for that just blew me away. And I think that there's a lot of leadership and experience coming out of post-communist Europe now. It's not all Viktor Orban. Ruth, I want to ask you a closing question, but if you'll permit me, I also want to just give a brief answer to two people who've asked about the direction that India is going in under Narendra Modi. And I'll just say, Ranjit asked, what do you see happening in India with Modi? He has suppressed minority religious rights and silenced civil rights, press freedom, and so on. And I will say, absolutely, this is very alarming. India is the largest democracy in the world. One of the things President Biden has done, Ruth, that has disappointed me is that, I mean, we need India as a counter to China and so on and so forth. We need more trade with India. But to bring him to Washington and honor him with a state dinner when he's doing this to the opposition and really decimating the universities and civil society, it just sends the wrong signal. I don't know if you have any thought about that before my closing question.
No, I agree. I agree.
So, closing question, and briefly, what gives you hope? What gives you optimism?
A lot does, because one might think, given what I study, that I would not be optimistic. But we're in the middle of living through a renaissance of mass nonviolent protests. And there's over a dozen countries that have had in recent years, from Chile, Belarus, Israel itself. We're part of this in the US. The biggest protests they've ever had, or the biggest protest in many, many years. And that was the case of Poland. It's a big deal that it was the biggest protest since 1989. And, you know, the Women's March that we don't hear so much about or think about, it was the largest protest in American history, surpassed only by Black Lives Matter, where 20 million people in a pandemic came out to some kind of event, and they were multiracial, multi-generational. So there's an enormous energy. And think about the revival of labor actions, which is not just in the States. So people are demonstrating that they want different form of governance. They want equitable governance. They want social justice. They want reproductive rights. They want, you know, a solution to the climate crisis. And this I find extremely hopeful. And it's a sign that, and think of the conditions like in Iran, that the bravery they're showing, which speaks to the depth of their sentiments. And that's not, they can repress these things, these governments, but they're not going to go away. So that gives me hope.
Well, that's great. And this came home to me recently at a conference of our Jewish Community Center, the Z3 conference in Palo Alto, when the former Deputy Attorney General of the former Attorney General of the State of Israel, and then the Deputy Chief Justice of their constitutional court, their Supreme Court, after that, said he'd been going every week to, you know, with his grandchildren on his shoulder, to the demonstrations against Netanyahu's power grab over the Supreme Court.
Oh, those protests are extraordinary. They're actually a textbook case. Protests can be sustained and successful when they involve what's called the pillars of society. And that means you don't only have the people you might think are going to be at protests, grassroots activists, students. You have CEOs, you have important people in the defense, who were defense officials. You have all kinds of people going, and it becomes like a cross-class, cross-sector, true representation of the nation. And that happened in Israel, and it's happened in other places as well. So there are liberatory energies out there, and in our country, I don't know if we'll have another round of protests. And as you know, many Republican states are doing their best to criminalize protest. But we should not forget that 2017 and 2020 are not that long ago, and there is a will to protect our democracy. We just had some good results yesterday from elections, and this isn't going away.
Well, we're out of time. Ruth Ben Ghiat, thank you so much for sharing your very wide-ranging and trenchant insights into authoritarianism and the ways to resist it. We invite our audience to join us next Wednesday, November 15th, when, as Janice said, the famous author and social and political commentator David Brooks of the New York Times will be in conversation with Madeline Brand about human nature and human connection. Until then, thank you for joining us. Please stay healthy and safe.